There's a kind of silence that isn't quiet at all. It is the silence inside a man standing at perfect attention while the world he has built, brick by slow brick, sacrifice by grinding sacrifice, gets dismantled in a single broadcast. A single sentence, spoken by someone he will never meet, in a room he will never enter, about a life that touches his in the way a stone thrown into a river touches the bottom. You feel it before it lands. That's the thing nobody tells you. It was the third Tuesday of November. I remember that specifically because my daughter had circled the date on the kitchen calendar in red marker. She does this with days she's decided matter. And she decided this one mattered because her school project on a monarchy was due, and she'd asked me 3 times the week before whether I thought the king would make an announcement before the Christmas season. They always do something before Christmas, she'd said, 9 years old, and already more certain about royal protocol than most adults I know. It's like a tradition. I told her I had no idea, which was the truth, which by that Tuesday morning, standing in a crowd outside the Clarence House gates with 40 other journalists and twice as many tourists, felt like a very specific kind of irony. The morning started the way London mornings start in November, reluctantly. The sky the color of a bruise going yellow. Not dramatic gray, not cinematic fog, just this flat, tired light that sits on everything like a damp coat. The kind of morning that makes you understand why the British developed a culture of complaining about weather. It's not whinging. It's a reasonable response to meteorological gaslighting. I'd been there since 7:30. My colleague, Priya, who has an almost supernatural ability to always have a warm coffee cup in her hand regardless of circumstances, had arrived at 8, looked at me, looked at the sky, said, "You look exactly like this weather," and handed me a paper cup that was already lukewarm. I drank it anyway. There were tourists. There are always tourists, which I had stopped finding remarkable until this morning when I started, for some reason, watching them. A Japanese couple in matching yellow raincoats, photographing the gates with a focus so intense you'd think the iron was doing something. 3 American teenagers filming themselves for videos they'd edit to trending audio later. An older German gentleman in a flat cap who had his hands clasped behind his back and was simply looking, not filming, not photographing, just standing and looking at the building like it owed him something he was too polite to collect. I liked him immediately. There was a guard stationed at the gate. Not the famous bearskin hat. That's the Buckingham Guard, the ceremonial ones the tourists line up to photograph, the ones who've become the most photographed people in Britain without ever having consented to a portrait. This guard was different, operational, the kind of still that isn't posed, but practiced 1,000 hours of standing until standing becomes its own language. His name, I would later learn, was Corporal James Whitmore. He was 29 years old. He had a wife named Sophie and 2 children, a boy, Marcus, who was 7, and an infant daughter nobody outside the family had seen yet, because she'd arrived 6 weeks premature, and the first 2 months of her life had been the kind of months a parent doesn't discuss with anyone who doesn't have to know. I did not know any of this at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. I knew none of it, but I was about to watch the moment that changed everything for him, and I was going to watch it from 12 feet away, and he was never going to know I saw. The announcement was expected at 10. By 9:45, the energy along the pavement had shifted in that invisible, collective way crowds shift when something is about to happen. Not because anyone has said anything, but because human beings are atmospheric. We read the air. We feel the barometric drop before the rain comes. Phones appeared. The tourists who'd been casually photographing gates were now holding their phones up differently. Recording. The journalists around me stopped talking to each other and started checking feeds. Priya touched my arm. "It's going to be the posting announcement." I looked at her. "I got a tip this morning," she said. "Regiment reassignments. Full overseas rotation. They're moving 3 units." I absorbed this. "When's it posted?" "With the announcement." Simultaneously, the German gentleman with the flat cap had apparently also felt the atmospheric shift because he'd stepped slightly forward, closer to the gate, his hands still clasped behind his back. He was watching the guard now. Not the building. The guard. I found myself doing the same. There's protocol for everything in the British military. For standing, for moving, for breathing during ceremony. There's protocol for what your face does and does not do while you are in position. You are not a person in those moments. You are a function, a symbol, a living piece of architecture that the country has decided to make human, barely, just enough to breathe and blink. Corporal James Whitmore understood this. He had understood it for 7 years. He was standing at the gate when someone, a junior officer, civilian clothed, moving with the careful urgency of someone carrying something delicate, came out of the building and stood approximately 4 feet to his left. I couldn't hear what was said. I don't think anything was said. What I saw was the junior officer hold up a phone, screen facing Whitmore, and then step back, and then nothing. Nothing in the way that a man who has been trained to be nothing in public continues to be nothing while reading something that is clearly, visibly, physically something. I want to be precise here because this is the part that matters. I want to be precise because I've replayed it since, in the shower, over dinner, at 2 in the morning when the city gets quiet enough that you can hear your own thoughts properly. His jaw tightened. That was first. Not dramatic. Not a clench. Just a slight cellular tightening, the kind your jaw does when you're preventing your mouth from doing something your training forbids. Then, his left hand, the hand hanging at his side, pressed against the seam of his trousers, curled. Not a fist. Partway. 3 fingers bending inward and stopping. His eyes didn't move. That's what was extraordinary about it. His eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed at the middle distance, that specific nowhere that trained soldiers look at, that horizon that exists only inside a practiced mind, while everything else in him was very quietly breaking or bracing. I couldn't tell which. I'm still not sure. The announcement came through the speakers mounted along the facade. One of the Royal Communications officers read it in the measured, glass-smooth tone they cultivate at whatever school trains Royal Communications officers. Overseas deployment. Reorganization of 2 regiments. Full rotation effective the 1st of the new year. 11 words that, depending on where you were standing when you heard them, meant entirely different things. For the tourists, they meant nothing. They were already back to photographing the gate. For the journalists around me, they meant copy, angle, deadline. For Corporal James Whitmore, standing 12 feet from where I stood, they meant Sophie. They meant Marcus. They meant a 6-week premature daughter who had just started sleeping through the night. They meant a terraced house in Wiltshire with a mortgage that factored in his London posting. They meant a mother-in-law who'd moved into the spare room temporarily to help with the baby. They meant Christmas. They meant the entire architecture of a life reshuffled. In 11 words, while he stood at a gate and could not move and could not speak and could not press his fingers against his eyes and breathe the way the rest of us can when the world goes sideways. The junior officer returned the phone to his pocket and walked back inside. The crowd began dispersing. Journalists making calls. Tourists drifting toward the next landmark on their apps. The Japanese couple in yellow raincoats was already moving south, already onto the next photograph. The German gentleman with the flat cap did not move. He was still watching Whitmore, and I was watching both of them. Whitmore's hand slowly uncurled at his side. All 5 fingers deliberately returned to flat, pressed against his trouser seam. His jaw released, and something in his face, I can only describe it as something going very deep, very fast, the way a stone drops in a dark water and disappears before you've finished watching it fall, went somewhere internal. Somewhere the protocol couldn't reach, but also couldn't follow. He was still standing perfectly. He was standing perfectly, and he was somewhere else entirely. I have covered a lot of things in this job. I have stood outside buildings where things happened that I then wrote about for people who weren't there. I have interviewed people on the worst days of their lives, and the best days, and the strange administrative days in between that turn out to matter more than either extreme. I have learned, over 11 years, that the most important moments are almost never the ones with the biggest noise. They are the ones with the quietest witness. That Tuesday, I was the quietest witness I've ever been. I didn't write about Whitmore. There was nothing to write. He'd done nothing notable by any external measure. He'd stood at a gate. He'd received information. He'd continued standing at a gate. The story I filed was about the announcement, the regiment, the logistics, But this is the story I've been carrying since. 3 months later, through a contact who knew someone who knew the regimental admin, I learned that Whitmore had been among the deployed. He'd reported on the 1st of January. Sophie had stayed in Wiltshire. The mother-in-law had extended her stay. The baby, whose name I finally learned was Eliza, had started reaching for things, batting at objects with her small, uncertain hands. The way babies begin to understand that the world has edges they can touch. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a man standing at a gate and a baby batting at the air in Wiltshire and the 11 words between them. And I thought about how the most disciplined thing I have ever witnessed was not a ceremony or a parade or a formal changing of the guard with its choreographed precision and its gleaming buttons. It was a man's left hand, 3 fingers curling inward, stopping, returning to flat. The radio was on. This is where it starts for me, not at the gate, not with the journalists and the tourists and the flat November sky. For me, it starts in a kitchen in Wiltshire at approximately 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, with the BBC playing low from the radio on the counter, and Eliza doing the thing she'd recently started doing where she'd wake from her nap and not cry, just lie in the travel cot in the corner, making small experimental sounds, testing the acoustics of being alive. Sophie Whitmore was standing at the counter. She had a mug of tea she'd reheated twice already and forgotten both times. The mug had a chip on the handle she kept meaning to replace. She hadn't replaced it. She had other things. Her mother, Janet, who everyone called Jan, who had arrived in September with 2 suitcases and the particular competence of a woman who has raised children and has opinions about how other people raise theirs but is disciplined enough not to say most of them out loud, was in the sitting room, running a hoover over carpet that didn't especially need hoovering because Jan processed anxiety through domestic action, and this was a Tuesday with an anticipated announcement. Sophie knew the announcement was coming. James had mentioned it 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Carefully, in the particular careful way, he mentioned things he didn't want to worry her about, which meant she'd been worried since the first mention. It's probably nothing, he'd said the first time. Probably routine, he'd said the second. The third time he hadn't said anything at all, just kissed her on the forehead on his way out the door and held on a half-second longer than usual. She'd watched him go down the front path and get into his car, and she'd stood in the doorway in her socks. It was cold, the flagstones were cold, she should have put shoes on, and she'd thought, a half-second longer than usual. That was the thing about 11 years with a person. You learn the unit. Eliza made a sound from the travel cot. Not distressed. Curious. The sound she made at the ceiling fan. Sophie went over and looked down at her. 6 weeks premature, which had felt like the world ending when it happened. The NICU, the wires, the nurses who were kind in that specific, efficiently kind way that means they've done this 10,000 times, and know things you don't about how it ends. And now here she was at 3 months actual age, tracking the ceiling fan with her dark eyes, apparently in possession of opinions about air circulation. You've got opinions, Sophie said to her. Eliza ignored this. Sophie picked her up anyway and stood at the counter and drank the cold tea and listened to the radio. The announcement came at 10 o'clock exactly. Overseas deployment. Reorganization of 2 regiments. Full rotation effective the 1st of the new year. Sophie did not move. Eliza, held against her chest, made another sound. The ceiling fan sound pointed now at the window where the November garden was doing what November gardens do, which is look patient and brownly exhausted. From the sitting room, the hoover stopped. Sophie heard the silence where the hoover had been. Then Jan's footsteps. Measured. Her mother was measuring her footsteps. Sophie, I heard. A pause. Do you want? I'm fine. She was not fine. She was standing in her kitchen holding her infant daughter, and her tea had gone cold, and her husband was standing at a gate somewhere in London being told the same thing she'd just been told, and he could not. She knew this. She felt this in the particular frequency married people share. He could not move or speak or let his face do anything at all. This is what she was thinking about. Not herself. Him. Him, standing there, being absolutely unable to be a person for however long it took the crowd to disperse. She had, over 11 years, learned to be afraid of many things. Deployment notifications. The specific ring of a military number. The pauses before sentences that start with "there's something I need to tell you." She had not expected that the thing she'd be most afraid of in that moment was his stillness. She'd seen her practice it. At home, sometimes the military bearing would surface even off-duty, standing in the kitchen making toast, and going very straight and very still for a moment, some old muscle memory firing. And she'd tease him about it, and he'd come back to himself and laugh, and it was fine. But this was different. This was him standing at a gate, and hearing that his daughter's first Christmas he would not be there for, and he could not a flicker, not a breath too deep, nothing. Sophie pressed her face into Eliza's neck. Eliza smelled like talcum powder, and something she could never name, something that was just baby, just specific and irreplaceable. "I'm fine," Sophie said again, to no one in particular. Jan came into the kitchen anyway. She was 63 years old and had been married for 31 years to a man who drove HGVs and was therefore intimate with the experience of sending someone you love away and waiting for them to come back. She had views on this. She also had the discipline, the hard-earned, long-practiced discipline, to know when her views were useful and when they were not. She filled the kettle. She did not say anything. She set the kettle on and stood beside Sophie and put one hand on her daughter's back, just resting it there, not rubbing or patting, just present, just the warm weight of a hand saying, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and the kettle is on." Sophie was not a crying person. She'd worked hard at not being a crying person. Not from shame, not from suppression, but from some personal internal logic that said, "If I start, I don't know where it ends." She'd been this way since she was a teenager. Her therapist some years back had called it compartmentalizing with proficiency, which was therapist language for, "You're very good at this, and it is both useful and concerning." She did not cry in her kitchen on that Tuesday morning. She stood and held Eliza and felt the weight of her mother's hand on her back and listened to the kettle beginning its low, electrical grumble. And she thought about January. She thought about January with the kind of specific, practical, survival mode thinking that was her most honest talent. What it looked like, who would handle the mortgage, whether Jan could stay, whether she should call the family liaison, whether Marcus's school had the family counselor contact they'd been given, and whether she'd filed it somewhere she could now find. She thought about Marcus, who was at school, who did not yet know, who would come home at 3:15 and drop his backpack by the door in the way she'd asked him 40 times not to do, and who would look at her face because he always read her face first, had done since he was 3 years old, and who would know before she said anything. She thought about what she would say. She thought about how to say it in a way that was honest and not frightening, and that acknowledged that it was in fact frightening without making it feel unsurvivable, because it was survivable. She knew this. She had the receipts. She'd done it before, but knowing something is survivable and standing at the beginning of it holding a 3-month-old with a chipped mug on the counter are two different things. Her phone lit up on the counter. James. Not a call. A message. 2 words. "I know." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she typed back, "Me too." Then, after a second, "Eliza has opinions about the ceiling fan." She watched the screen. 3 dots appearing. Waiting. Disappearing. Appearing again. She's right. That fan is fascinating. Sophie let out something that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and lived in the narrow space between them. Eliza startled slightly at the sound and then settled, unimpressed. "Sorry," Sophie whispered to the baby. The kettle clicked off. Jan poured the tea without asking. She told Marcus that evening. He came in at 3:15, dropped the backpack by the door, looked at her face. She watched him read it. He was 7, which is old enough to understand that faces carry information, and young enough that he hadn't yet learned to not show that he'd read it. His own face did the thing. A small collapse, quickly caught, the way you catch a glass before it hits the floor. "Is it Dad? Come sit with me." They sat at the kitchen table. Eliza was in the bouncer in the corner, still working on her ceiling fan theories. Jan had disappeared upstairs with the tact of someone who understands the geometry of family conversations. Sophie told him the way she'd planned it. Honest, not frightening, acknowledging that it was in fact hard. Marcus listened with the focused, effortful listening of a child trying to be braver than he is. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, will he be back before my birthday? His birthday was in April. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. This was the truth. The rotation was 6 months. He nodded, absorbing it, filing it somewhere. Okay, he said. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, 7 years old, his small, warm hand around hers. And they sat like that for a while in the kitchen, while Eliza conducted her research on ceiling architecture, and the November light went thin and bluish through the window. Later, after Marcus was in bed, and Jan had gone to sleep, and Eliza had finally consented to sleep herself, Sophie sat on the sofa with her phone. She opened the gallery. She found a photograph from 8 months ago, before Eliza, before the premature birth, and the NICU, and the weeks that had aged her in ways that didn't show on the outside, but she could feel had permanently reconfigured something in her chest. The photograph was nothing. A Saturday morning photograph. James at the kitchen table with Marcus, both of them eating cereal, both of them in the specific disarray of weekend morning domesticity, neither of them posed or performing. Marcus was mid-sentence. James was looking at him with the expression he had when Marcus was talking, this undisguised, whole-face attention that she had loved in him since the first time she saw it directed at her, sitting across a table from him in a pub in Salisbury 13 years ago, thinking, this is a man who listens like it's important. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then, she set the phone down. The house was quiet, that specific post-children quiet that is different from all other quiets. Loaded, temporary, beautiful in the way that temporary things are beautiful. Sophie sat in it. She did not cry. She made a list in her head. Practical. Survivable. She added, call James in the morning, proper call, not just text. She added, ask Jan about staying through spring. She added, find the family liaison number. She added at the bottom of the list, in the part of her mind that was not practical or survivable, but just true. Count the days that I went back in March. I don't entirely know why. The story I'd filed had been published, edited down to 400 words about regiment logistics, and had lived its brief news cycle life before being buried by the next thing. That's the nature of it. Things happen. Things get written. Things get buried. The city keeps producing events faster than anyone can process them. But I went back. It was a different Tuesday. Warmer. Not warm. This is London in March, but the specific London warmth that feels like generosity because you've been so cold for so long. The sky had actual blue in patches. The tourists were wearing fewer layers. The Japanese couple in the yellow raincoats were not there, obviously, but there was a new set of tourists, and they were doing the same things tourists always do, which is to say they were discovering that standing in front of famous places feels different in person than in photographs. And most of them hadn't decided yet if that was better or worse. I stood on the pavement outside the Clarence House gates. Different guard today. Younger, I thought, though that's a thing I've started noticing, that people in certain uniforms seem younger every year, which I know is just me getting older, but is still a disorienting thing to notice. Priya was not with me. I hadn't told her I was coming back. I wasn't entirely sure I could explain it coherently. I just needed to stand in the place again. There is something about places where invisible things happen. I've noticed this over the years. Places where something significant occurred but left no mark, no plaque, no changed architecture, nothing you could photograph. They still carry something. Or maybe I carry it. Maybe I put it there and then stand in the place and receive it back, which is a form of fiction but might also be the closest thing to how humans actually store experience. I stood at the gate for 20 minutes. I thought about Whitmore. By March, I'd pieced together a little more of the picture. Through the regimental contact, through a brief conversation with someone in his unit's administrative chain who spoke with the careful vagueness of someone telling you something without technically telling you anything. He deployed on January 3rd. He'd called home from his satellite phone on the 5th. Marcus had apparently told him in that call that Eliza had learned to grab things. Full fist. She'd grabbed Marcus's finger and refused to let go for 3 minutes. James had laughed. The person who told me this hadn't met him, was relaying it secondhand, but they told me. Apparently he laughed for a while. I had thought about that. The specific quality of laughing at information about your infant daughter grabbing things from a satellite phone from somewhere your wife doesn't have the coordinates to, but has been given a liaison number 4. The compound absurdity and tenderness of that laugh. I thought about it now, standing at the gate. There's a question that had been sitting at the back of my head since November. I hadn't been able to answer it. I tried a few different framings. The question was, what is it actually costing? Not in the abstract. Not the aggregate national cost, the policy cost, the budget allocation, and deployment rotation arithmetic of military families who are always sort of quietly understood to be absorbing something significant and are thanked for their service and then absorb back into the general population of people the country doesn't think about very often. That, the specific unit of cost. A man standing at a gate, 3 fingers curling, stopping, returning to flat. A woman in a kitchen with a chipped mug, and a baby who has discovered ceiling fans, and a son who reads faces. A list of practical things. Liaison number, mortgage, count the days. The new guard at the gate did something that stopped me. It was nothing, smaller than nothing. He shifted his weight, 1 millimeter, foot to foot. A movement so small that if you weren't already watching, you'd miss it completely. But I was watching, and I thought, there it is. The human underneath the function. The weight of a body that has been standing still for a long time, and the involuntary biology of that. The blood moving, the muscles making micro-adjustments, the body quietly insisting it is alive even when the protocol would prefer it to be architecture. I thought about Whitmore standing at this same gate, or one like it, reading something on a phone screen that someone held up for exactly long enough. I thought about the moment after the screen was put away. The moment of what? Not processing. Processing implies time and internal liberty that he didn't have. Something faster than processing. More animal. The way information lands before you've decided what to do with it. The way your body knows before your mind catches up. His jaw. His hand. His eyes not moving. There's a man I spoke to once a few years back for a different story entirely. A retired colonel, 60-something, military career spanning some 3 decades, who'd sat across from me in a pub in Pimlico with a half a bitter and talked about the discipline of emotional management in ways that I still haven't finished unpacking. He'd said, people think it's about suppression. It isn't suppression. Suppression breaks eventually. What it is, what you train toward, is displacement. You take the feeling and you put it somewhere in you that you can access later, in private, in your own time. You don't kill it. You park it. I thought that was interesting at the time, a clinical way of describing something that seemed to be anything but clinical. Standing at the gate in March, I thought about it differently. Parking it. The image of a car, some battered, reliable thing, being parked in a lot. Turned off. Locked. The driver walking away knowing exactly where it is, knowing the walk back, knowing the door still opens. Whitmore's 3 fingers. Parking it. The jaw returning to ease. Parking it. The eyes staying fixed at the middle distance. The whole thing, the whole weight of January, and Sophie, and Marcus, and Eliza, and the mortgage, and the mother-in-law, and the Christmas, and the April birthday, all of it, in the space of, however, many seconds it took the junior officer to return the phone to his pocket, and walk back inside, parked. I understood, standing at the gate in March, that this was not a failure of feeling. It was the most competent, most costly, most invisible form of it. I called Sophie. I should explain, I had not spoken to her at this point. I'd had only the second-hand accounts, the administrative relay of information that had built the outline of her. She was an outline to me. The kitchen, the mug, the list, the hand held across the table. An outline I'd constructed from what I knew and what I could feel the edges of, the way you sometimes know a room from the quality of light coming under its door. I called her because I needed to know if the outline was right. She answered on the 3rd ring. I introduced myself, explained briefly who I was, how I'd come to be standing outside the gate on the day of the announcement. I told her I wasn't writing a piece about her family specifically. I was writing about something harder to name, about what the announcement had looked like from where I was standing. A pause on the line. You were there, she said. Yes. What did he look like? It wasn't a question, or it was a question that had been sitting in her for 4 months, compressed down to that flat, factual shape. What did he look like? When he heard, I told her. I told her about the jaw, the hand, the 3 fingers, the eyes not moving. I told her it lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then he was perfectly himself again, externally. Perfectly the gate. Another pause. That's James, she said. Something in her voice that I couldn't fully name. Not pride exactly. Not grief exactly. The thing that exists between the two of them, where they share the same country and mean entirely different things by it. How is Eliza? I asked. A sound from Sophie's end. Something domestic and warm in the background. The clattering of something plastic, which is the ambient sound of households with infants. She pulled herself up this morning, Sophie said. Just grabbed the cot rail and pulled. She was absolutely furious about it. Didn't know what to do once she was up. Does she know? She looked like she was deciding whether this was a victory or a mistake. I laughed. Sophie laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from people who both know it isn't funny exactly, but is true, and truth has its own register. I'm sending him a video, she said. He'll watch it on a delay, but he'll watch it. There's an image I keep returning to. Whitmore in whatever forward location, satellite phone connection lagging, watching a video of a small dark-eyed girl gripping a cot rail and looking absolutely furious about her own capability. And laughing. That laugh the administrative contact had mentioned. The long one. I think about what it costs to put something in a parked lot in yourself and leave it there. And I think about what it must feel like to open the lock, to climb back in, to feel, in private, the weight of the thing you've been carrying at a remove for months. The mortgage, the mug, the ceiling fan research, the hand across the table, the socks on cold flagstones. And I think about whether the laugh at the video is the unlock, the moment the parked car starts, whether joy is how the bill comes due, for people who have trained themselves to be architecture in public. The guard at the gate shifted his weight again. I had been there long enough. I turned and walked back toward the tube, past the tourists and the food cart that smells like something unidentifiable, but warmly so, past the German gentleman or a man wearing the same flat cap, which is probably not the same man, but which I chose irrationally to believe was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the gate with the patient attention of someone who has learned that the important things are not the things that move. The title of the announcement was something about regimental reorganization. The headline I'd written was something about operational capacity and strategic deployment rotations. Neither of those was the story. The story was a man and a hand and a number of fingers. The story was a kitchen and a kettle and 2 words on a phone screen, I know. The story was a boy who reads his mother's face. A baby conducting research on ceiling fans. A laugh from a satellite phone arriving on delay. The story was the cost that has no line item, the sacrifice that has no ceremony, the gate that stands at the edge of a life and does not move while everything on the other side of it does. James Whitmore came home in July. I know this because Sophie sent me a message. 1 photograph attached. No Kopfchen. The photograph. A front garden, brick path, the kind of ordinary terraced house that contains everything. And in the path, a man in civilian clothes, jeans, jacket, nothing official, nothing military, crouching down with his arms open. Marcus running toward him. Full sprint. Backpack still on. Eliza being held by Jan in the doorway, watching with the expression of a person who has been told about someone for months and is now deciding whether the reality matches the description. Sophie had taken the photograph from behind, from somewhere just inside the door. You can't see her face, but you can see in the way the photograph is slightly unsteady, the particular blur of a phone held by hands that were not entirely steady, what her face was doing. The gate is still there. It always will be. It does not know what it witnessed. The gate is a gate. The witnessing is ours.